Alright guys, we are continuing with Chapter 10, The Presidency Road to the White House. We are beginning today with Section 2. Section 2 talks about the nomination process that a president has to go through to become a candidate. And we talked about this in class. The candidate announces his or her plan to run for the presidency, then campaigns to win delegate and potential voter support in the primaries. The caucuses and the primary elections take place in the states. The nominee for the president is announced at the National Party Convention. Citizens cast their votes on the Tuesday after the first Monday of November in the general election. The Electoral College casts its votes. You have to have at least 270 electoral votes to be elected president. Very important to know that. And that the president is inaugurated on January the 20th. Alright, so primary hurdles. The Constitution actually gives no specific guidelines for how to choose a presidential candidate. As long as they meet the criteria that we talked about before, they can be considered a candidate for the President of the United States. So in the beginning, what would happen is that the person who received the most electoral college votes will become the president, and the person who received the next highest amount will become vice president. Unfortunately, that didn't last very long. There was even an incident in which a president and the newly selected vice president actually got into a physical fist fight. So eventually they had to change how that was done. At the dawn of the 20th century, they were trying to find a way to give the people more of a voice in choosing presidential candidates, because before it would be the upper class or those in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So they tried to give the people a stronger voice in choosing a party's particular presidential candidate. And they did that through direct primaries. In 1903, Wisconsin became the first state to hold a direct primary for state offices. Very important to know that. That is a test question. The states that did not hold primary elections would use a form of convention known as a caucus. That is also a test question and something that you need to know. So it didn't take long for primary elections to become popular and sort of the norm. So with the rise in the number of primaries, there was also a rise in the number of convention delegates that were won in the primaries. Delegates are representatives of a particular party who pledge their undying support to a specific candidate and their nomination at the National Party Convention. So presidential candidates work hard during the campaign to win delegate and voter support. Most of the delegates are won long before the convention. They're won mainly in the primaries. That is also a test question. Primary elections have two basic purposes. This is also a test question, so make sure you know the two basic purposes of presidential primaries. The first is to open up the field to more candidates, making it more, of course, a democratic process. So that makes the national delegate selection more democratic. The process differs from state to state because parties are regulated at the state level. So make sure you know the two basic purposes of the primary. Open up the field, make the national delegate selection more democratic. And how many of you know what GOP means? If you guys actually research that and find that out, can tell that to me, I will give you and your group extra points. So find out what that means. GOP. So here we're going to talk about the types of primary elections All three of these are test questions. You have your closed primary elections, in which the people who participate have to be registered as members of one specific party, and they can only vote for the candidates of that particular party. You have open primaries, in which you do not have to tell anybody what party you belong to, and you just vote based on the candidate you want to choose, be it Republican or Democrat. You vote based on what the candidate you want to choose. And lastly, we have crossover voting, which is a fear for any major party. This is voting for a weak candidate in an opposing party's primary to cause greater difficulty in the major opponent's nomination. So if a party has a major candidate, they don't want anybody to cross over and vote for a weak candidate, because that will mess up the chances of their major candidate actually becoming the announced presidential candidate for that particular party. So crossover voting is major fear. The stretch of primaries in an election year normally begins with the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. So these are the two states that hold the first caucus and the first primary in an election year. Very important to know that that is a test question. In the elections since the 1970s, the Democratic parties have resulted in candidates that are more liberal due to where the the caucus and the primary takes place. So they're more liberal, especially in the Democratic Party, than the mainstream Democrats. If you think about some of Obama's controversial viewpoints, talking about homosexuality, and abortion, those things were a result of Obama having more liberal views. After the primary, you have the national convention, and this is where the presidential candidate for a particular party is announced. National conventions began in the 1830s and continue to be the main means for formally nominating a presidential candidate. Committee members who make the choice for the party, the important thing that they look for when choosing a location to have the national convention is just a place that's convenient, a place with a large convention center, hotels, restaurants, and entertainment. Important to know that, because that's a part of a test question as well. The convention also serves as a place for adopting the party platform and launching that unified campaign for the November elections. So the platform is the statement of the party's position on current issues, and they choose it every 4 years at the national convention. So it's discussed, and they let the world know that the candidate that is chosen will support this particular platform. Unfortunately, the process of democratization has weakened this in both major parties, both Republican and Democrat. Very important to know what the party platform is. During this time, super delegates, which were instituted by the Democratic Party, also are introduced to the crowd. Okay, they serve as uncommitted delegates. These are leaders, they are office holders. They don't have to give their loyalty to anybody. The first day of the convention is pretty much highlighted by the keynote address. Make sure you know what a keynote address is. This is a speech that is made by a leading party member that shows the enthusiasm of a particular party and for the particular candidate. And they also make fun of and make mean comments toward the opposing party during this particular time. Now, before your national convention, you've had a series of smaller conventions in which first ballot nominations have become normal. However, failure to give one candidate the majority vote on the first roll call sometimes remain a possibility. But for the most part, they have regular nominations so that when they get to the national convention, they'll go ahead and announce who that particular candidate is. Every now and then you can have a broker convention. You guys, this is a test question as well. This is a convention that requires lengthy balloting and an eventual settlement. by means of bargaining and compromise, but for the most part, they try to avoid this, and the first ballot nomination is what prevails. Remember how earlier I said that it used to be the person with the greatest number of electoral college votes was the president, and the person with the next greatest number was the vice president. But because of conflict, this had to change. So this is now the process. Nominating a vice president is now done by the presidential nominee. So once that candidate is chosen, that candidate also chooses a vice president, and they're mainly announced at the same time during the national convention. The choice generally centers around geography and ideology, where that person lives and how they think and believe. The presidential candidate looks to normally balance the ticket. They're not going to have somebody that completely agrees with them, somebody that helps kind of round them out in their decision-making process. And finally, after the presidential candidate is chosen, move on to the presidential debates. The presidential debates occur between candidates and has been a part of the American political process since 1858 with Lincoln and Douglas. The most famous debates in American history, of course, discuss slavery, and they dealt with national expansion. It is very important to know that the first televised presidential debates began with the election of 1960 and included candidates Kennedy and Nixon. Remember, you were able to see what they both looked like during those debates, and I told you guys when we discussed how that had an impact on how the election turned out. And that is the end of section 2. So let's have a really quick pop quiz. True or false? Presidential candidates win most of their delegates in the primaries long before conventions are held. What are the two basic purposes of the presidential primary? What term means party leaders and office holders who serve as uncommitted delegates to the party's national convention? Who chooses the vice presidential candidate today? Which state was the first to hold a direct primary? What is the party's formal statement of its position on current issues called? What term means a convention requiring lengthy balloting and an eventual settlement by means of bargaining and compromise? Which presidential election had the first televised debate? And I mean, what year? And finally, what term means voting for a weak candidate in an opposing party's primary to cause greater difficulty in the major opponent's nomination? Hopefully you guys can answer these questions without your notes. See you in class.